about WQIPs, but just that idea that it is this mix of science and evidence-based decision-making with a really strongly collaborative approach, we did come up with what I would refer to as feasible load and estuary concentration targets in our plan. Feasible because we know that they can be achieved. They are still aspirational in a lot of ways because it'll take an awful lot to achieve them. We looked at identifying barriers to adoption and how we might overcome some of those, and the recommendations around feasible targets actually take those ideas of which actions are adoptable, not just which ones have high leverage and which ones can create major change, but which ones can actually be adopted and will be adopted. Things like fertiliser management, as we heard, they're the low-hanging fruit. You only have to convince someone that they're going to make more money. That's pretty easy as a sell. Some of the other actions we're looking at are very expensive and they're not going to be adopted at a large scale. Okay, so what we did look at was nitrogen, phosphorus, suspended sediments, and that's the Tamar estuary at Launceston. There's a perception that we've got a sediment issue there. It is a sediment-dominated upper estuary anyway. It's more of a community perception issue. We have a major issue around recreational water quality and enterococci. This is the gorge. For anyone that's been there, this is like an icon tourist site, which is right in Launceston itself. That is toilet paper coming out of a pipe, flowing directly into the estuary, which is about 10 metres away. Not very pleasant. So we do have some really big issues with a combined sewer and stormwater system. So the plan itself looked at a range of diffuse pollutant sources. We do have a small area of dairy in the catchment, but it's quite significant. We have a lot of grazing, forestry, cropping, horticulture, rural, residential and urban. We looked at a range of point sources, so there are 26 wastewater treatment plants in the catchment. We have a real legacy issue around wastewater treatment in Tassie. About 60% of our STPs are non-compliant, and they're non-compliant with old standards, not Australian modern technology type standards. So we do have some really serious issues around wastewater treatment. We are triaging our way of sort of fixing those. We have a combined sewer and stormwater system in Launceston that's quite old. It has some benefits to it because our stormwater is being treated for large parts of the time, but whenever it flows, it does essentially release a mix of stormwater and raw sewerage into the estuary. Not a great outcome. As we do more and more infill redevelopment with very large impervious areas, obviously that issue is being exacerbated. There is also a salmon farm in the estuary, which was included. My role in this was actually to build a decision support system and then to use that decision support system to support the development of the plan. The underlying model underneath that decision support system included a catchment export model and an estuary water quality model, but into that I developed and linked a number of management modules. So we obviously needed modules around wastewater treatment plants and those point sources. There are also catchment-specific management modules around all of the major land uses. So every catchment I've gone to has a different set of management modules because the actions in that catchment often operate quite differently. What's acceptable to the local communities there is quite different as well. So those things evolve over time. Van Diemen Aquaculture, who run the major salmon farm, were wonderful and actually opened their whole database up to us and gave us data on all their fish stock numbers and inputs and outputs in terms of nutrients, so we were able to model their practices as well. The plan itself is actually quite an enormous document. It has a lot of different stories, as I would refer to them, inside it. These stories were told using the results of the decision support system, and they were told for a number of different reasons. So some of those stories related to where do pollutants come from. So this idea of what contribution point and diffuse sources make to both current but also potential future loads and concentrations as we change land use. We looked at demonstrating the benefits of some of our past practice change, so showing that some of the things we've done in the past are really beneficial and what might they have done. So we've got the Forest Practices Code. We actually were able to model that and see what benefit that it had for water quality. We looked at impacts of future land use change, so we have a lot of dairy expansion. They were talking about an extra 40,000 cows in the catchment. That's a fairly major expansion of dairy. So we looked at what the impact of that with and without best management practices was. So we could put recommendations over that. We also looked at urban development and urban expansion. We looked at then the leverage and effectiveness of potential management actions in each of the major land uses, which helped us to prioritise the different management actions. So, these scenarios, I ran essentially a bunch of scenarios that started off with 100% adoption. So this is the kind of gold standard idealistic idea, which is a leverage scenario. Which actions actually have leverage to make change in the catchment? I took them to workshops with key stakeholders, and then we talked about, well, that's not actually going to happen in the real world. What are the barriers to adoption of each of those actions? What level of adoption could we actually achieve with things like education programs, incentives, both upfront and for maintenance costs for things like riparian vegetation corridors? And we went through coming up with a range of adoption scenarios for individual practices in different landscapes and land uses under those different practice types. So rolling out different types of programs, what could we do? We popped them back in our modelling and said, okay, this is what we can achieve on the ground. We can also cost that, because we can say, well, how much is that going to cost? It's not cheap. Mm-hmm. This is the range of actual stories, and I won't go through them because they're largely what you see there, but we did look at things like aquaculture. There is also a very large plan on the drawing board at the moment looking at reconfiguration of the sewage treatment plants around Launceston. That's about a $300 to a $500 million project. So these are large projects and very large budgets to implement some of these things. So this one's always the first one, and this is actually a fascinating chart for most people. Everyone knows where pollutants come from. They don't come from me, they come from that guy over there. So when we actually start to break these things down, a lot of the education that we do is just about, well, this is where it comes from. It might not be controllable, and I'm not saying you can control one source or the other, but this is where it comes from. Most people think, in the general public, that recreational water quality is around STPs. It's not often. They actually do a pretty good job of taking enterococci out, but they're about nutrients. They produce a lot of the nutrients that go into the estuary, and they produce them, in our case, right direct on the estuary. Aquaculture is the yellow bit in terms of nutrients, so that it's a reasonable contributor in terms of loads. The blue is obviously diffuse. Almost all the sediments are coming out of diffuse sources, but they're also big contributors to the other pollutants. When I break down the diffuse loads, and this is at a whole of tier catchment scale, this is 15% of Tassie, so this is a very large catchment. What we see is that probably the main land uses I'll pick out for you. Orange is the grazing area. Very large area, very small flow, but compared to the flow, so rather than the area, the pollutant loads are obviously large, particularly for enterococci and for nitrogen. Dairy is a tiny sliver of area in that, and a tiny sliver of flow, but it produces about 20% of the diffuse enterococci in the catchment. So, these things are having much bigger than their relative area and relative flow. The other one to look at is the red area there, which is urban. And the thing about urban is that it mostly fringes the estuary itself. So what it's putting in there is a very direct impact on the estuary. So we went through this process, we modelled these individual sort of leverages of all our various actions that we could do. We had this very intense key stakeholder consultation, and as I said, it got a lot bigger as the project went on because there was so much buy-in and so much excitement about the actual plan itself. We spent a lot of time talking about impediments and levels of adoption and created these feasible targets. From that, we actually put together a plan that has feasible load reduction targets, and this is what they look like. I've split them out so you can see what contribution comes from different areas. So the green things there are the contribution to the load target from diffuse sources and diffuse actions. The blue is just from this Launceston Sewerage Improvement Plan, so this is a reconfiguration of 5 of our current STPs around Launceston. The combined system overflows, so if we manage our combined system overflows coming out of that sewer stormwater area, that has that 6% reduction in enterococci, so a big impact on recreational water quality. What this chart tells me is that we can't actually invest in a single area and achieve what we're trying to achieve. So that's the first thing that lots of people took home as a take-home sort of message, that we need to work across diffuse and point sources. There's no single quick fix. We can actually achieve some pretty big load reductions with the right actions though. That's interesting, but the question is always then, well, how does that impact on the estuary? I've pulled out the concentration targets just for zone 1 there, which is right around Launceston. So this is the top of the catchment. This is that picture of silt that you saw, essentially. This is that part of the estuary. In that zone, and these, by the way, we have a report card as well, which is a very effective way of engaging the community. These are our report card zones. What we see there is the importance of diffuse is very different on this chart. So diffuse management of nutrients at the top of the Tamar estuary is not the big win. The big win is actually going to be in wastewater treatment plants. It does make a big contribution in terms of sediments though, sediment concentrations, and also enterococci. Where we put our lens though changes that story. So if I was to talk about algal blooms in Trevelyan Dam, which feeds into it, diffuse management is key. So sometimes it's about what we're actually focusing on in the landscape. We weren't focusing on the end of the pipe as the only priority. So we're not just looking at improving water quality in the estuary, we want to look at the whole catchment. So where we're up to, there is no single solution, and we need investment across all of these different things. What we're now doing is looking at developing a series of investment plans to implement the WQIP and secure investment, essentially. One of the biggest dilemmas we face in terms of trying to implement a plan of this scale is that even a $10 million investment is just a drop in a bucket. So these sorts of plans are incredibly expensive to actually implement 100% of. As I said, the LSIP is looking at about a $500 million investment. The CSOs has been costed at about $300 million. The diffuse management actions, if they were fully implemented, is over $100 million worth of investment. That's big numbers anywhere. Come to Tassie, that's a huge number. So the dilemma we've got is how do we actually sell the story about why it's still worth investing in these things, even though no one can come up with $100 million. It can be very hard to convince the community to continue to invest in these sorts of projects if they're not seeing changes on the ground. And the reality is that they could sink $10 million catchment wide and they can look out the window and there will be no difference. And this is a big part of the sell. So that's where we're up to at the moment. Our solution is to focus on investment in incremental, achievable and local goals as a pathway to full implementation. So we pick a target in terms of who might actually have funding. We pick a goal that's actually relevant to them and interesting and something that we can actually knock a fair bit of it off with a small investment. And then we use the CAPER DSS. We've gone back to our DSS and we're running scenarios to actually fine-tune which of the actions we've recommended would you actually implement to achieve that goal. And our concept is to run around the landscape, gradually implementing the entire WQIP, but essentially picking off pieces of it that are achievable, but also that are desirable from a community perspective, so they can see what the benefits of their investments are. We're considering actions that are high leverage, so they have to have a large impact on loads. They have to be adoptable, so we're trying to pick the stuff that's actually easy to get out there on the ground, and we've got the feedback from key stakeholders to tell us where that can be done with incentives, and that are measurable. So some of our actions are very hard for us to report back in a 3-year period. What did they do? Who took this stuff on board? What was the impact of it? This is the range of actions that are in our 3 main contributors that I picked out there. So there were 8 different actions that we looked at in dairy, 3 in grazing areas, and in urban we looked at water-sensitive urban design, that sort of larger scales as well as household scales. The work that we've done recently has been to sort of narrow this down into a smaller range of actions for our initial investment plans. These are high leverage actions, so if I had one thing I would invest in dairy, I would get the stock out of streams. I would get all of the stock out of streams. It's low-hanging fruit, it's incredibly effective, and it's actually saleable and adoptable. So really good impact. Effluent management, which comes back to your story about nutrients and money on farm. That's saleable as well, because essentially once you sell the idea that effluent is fertiliser, effluent is money, and if you're putting that in the right places, you don't have to buy fertiliser, it's much easier to get people to adopt that practice change than if we're trying to tell them to put a 20-metre riparian buffer in, which isn't very effective in our dairy landscapes. In grazing areas, riparian re-veg is actually a lot more effective, but not at the sorts of scales that people have traditionally run for programs. So we're asking for 5-metre buffers. 5-metre buffers do most of the work. We know that our farmers would willingly adopt 5-metre buffers, whereas anything wider than that, they start to get pretty nervous. Stock access to streams is the other one, and ensuring access to high quality fresh water is the big part of that. So long as we get the water troughs right, that's a big part of it. Urban, we looked at large scale lucid. Now, in terms of deciding on the focus for investment, there's really these two different lenses that we put over it. So one is thinking about an environmental outcome that we're actually trying to achieve. And there are a whole pile of different ones. So one of the ones at the moment that we're floating with is actually improving water quality in Zone 1, because most people live in Launceston. It's very politically sensitive, Zone 1 water quality, and anyone who's lived there, I'm seeing smiles from people that have, will know it's on the front page of the paper very frequently. So it's an area where the state government and the federal government are happy to sink money. So we need to think about that. We also need to think about what are we actually working with? Are we talking about recreational water quality? Are we talking about nutrients? Are we talking about sediments? The actions we put up will achieve benefits in all of those different areas, but the ones that we choose through that lens will some of them are more effective than others. I'll put up 3 different just alternatives to show you the technique that we're going through. I'm not actually putting up the ones that we're considering at the moment, because they're all behind closed doors and commercial in confidence and things like that. So these are just simple examples of how effective this approach can be. So looking at 3 really simple examples. One is to reduce sediment concentrations in the upper estuary. One is to reduce nutrient inputs into Trevelyan Dam, where we've had algal bloom issues in the past. And the other one's to look at recreational water quality in Zone 1 of the estuary as well, which is a very big political issue now. It's hit the front page of the paper a lot in the last couple of years. There are lots of other relevant goals that we might consider in the future. So things like some of the recreational sites that we have in the freshwater system, which are highly valued. We have taste and odour issues at a lot of our drinking water offtakes, so it's a good target for investment from people like Taswater. We have sediment smothering key habitats in some of our freshwater systems. Now this looks at 3 really small budgets, and I picked really small budgets to show you how much of the goal we can actually achieve with a very small budget. So if you think about $1 billion plan, $200,000 is a pretty small proportion of the investment. The diffuse actions alone, catchment-wide, are over $100 million. So these are very tiny investments in the implementation of the full plan. I picked a couple of options. So one was to look at dairy in the Meander catchment, which is our heavily dairy catchment. It's the pink one up there. The other one's to look at grazing in the northwest catchment, which is the purple one. The big difference is that Meander actually feeds through Trevelyan Dam to get to the estuary. So it has to get through a dam, which mutes the impact on the estuary itself. It means that those actions there actually impact the dam. The north-est delivers directly into Launceston, essentially. And we looked at those 5-metre riparian buffers with off-stream water. Okay, so looking at our 3 different goals and going through them, it's a bit of a, so what we said, when we run those scenarios, firstly, the north-est grazing, if we were targeting suspended sediments in the upper estuary, is the goer. Dairy management in the Meander is not going to touch sediments in the upper estuary. The other thing to look at there is that I'm getting essentially a factor of 10, an order of magnitude difference in terms of how much of the goal I'm achieving for the investment. Because I'm targeting my action specifically at that smaller scale goal, I'm actually achieving, in the case of a 0.6% of the total budget, so my $600,000, I achieve nearly 6% of the target. If I can convince someone to give me a couple of million, I can actually do things like achieve 50% of the target in some cases. So that's a powerful story, and they're things that we actually can see. Those level of change we might actually see in some of our monitoring data and on the ground. If I looked at Trevellyn Dam and nutrients, obviously the north-east doesn't go through the dam, so it has no impact. But we get big benefits from investment solely in one sub-catchment of the entire south-east catchment. So for a small investment in that one catchment, we achieve a large proportion of our local goal. The final one was about pathogens, and I've included this because it's a nice trade-off, where both of these achieved some of that benefit. The meander dairy, even though it's above the dam, is actually more effective than the north-east grazing, and that's got to do with intensities of use, the number of cows. There's a lot of factors that play into that, but essentially there's a lot more pathogen that comes off those areas, even though it's got to get through the dam in the way. But again, incredibly effective. So for 0.6% of our total implementation budget, so $600,000, we achieve 14% of the total target that we're trying to achieve. That is a convincing argument for government to invest $600,000. They're not going to give us $100 million, but if we can make this case that we can reduce concentrations to this extent, that's probably saleable. The other area that we're starting to use a lot of our decision support system and where we're going in terms of the next step is really looking at outcome reporting. And more we're finding that government investors really want reporting of outcomes. They're not interested in how many kilometres of fencing went in and how many water troughs, which is what we used to report on. More we're having to actually say, well, what did we achieve on the ground as a result of that investment? That's really challenging for water quality. The errors in water quality modelling, this is the room full of people that can tell me why this is challenging, but there's lots and lots of variation year to year. If I'm putting in $100,000, I'm not going to see it in the estuary because it's a pretty small investment. It takes a really long time for some of these things to play out. So all of those things make it really challenging for a 3-year funding cycle to say, well, what was the outcome of that? What we're starting to do is use the decision support system to at least be able to report on expected outcomes. So we take the model and we put the investments that have gone into the landscape and we actually model them as scenarios. And we say, well, for those, we've put these things out on the ground, we're expecting to see a 10% reduction or whatever in terms of nutrients. We focus at 2 different levels. So one would be on those completed actions and looking at outcomes against that primary goal of the specific investment that they were doing. We also do that in terms of trying to put together, because the tier program is collaborative and it's partnership based, we can now put the story together about everyone's individual investments and what that looks like in terms of full implementation of the WQIP. So we're actually being able to tell the whole story rather than the pieces of the story that people are doing, and that cumulative benefit. And that's really important for us to be able to account for that total effort made in implementing the WQIP, so that 5-10 years from now we can actually come back and say, well, we're 50% of the way there, we're 10% of the way there, how far towards these targets have we gone? It gives confidence that management actions in the catchment are actually acting in this coordinated way where we're trying to achieve a common goal, and it demonstrates that the actions aren't at odds with each other. And on that note, I will leave you with a picture of our estuary.